I'd like to start this event by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're on. We're on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So this event today, we're lucky to be joined by the Rescope Project and a panel of experts both in the room and from the other side of the world. And to introduce those people to you, I'm going to introduce Brendan Gleeson. Brendan Gleeson's from the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne. So I'm going to hand over to Brendan now to kick it off. Thanks very much, Brendan.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'll be brief. I'm sorry, I just got here. As a geographer, I seem to regularly get myself lost. Went to somewhere else I shouldn't have been. Anyway, made it. Sorry if I seem a bit sweaty. Look, yes, I'm from the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne. Really delighted to play a small supporting partnership role for these kind of discussions, and particularly to partner with the Rescope project as part of their Regenerating Society series, which is already off to a great start, and great to see you all here today. From our perspective at the University of Melbourne, these partnerships are just so incredibly important. It is my own view that given where the sort of trajectory that universities are on, increasing corporatisation and narrowness of their rather increasingly instrumental agendas, I'm certainly personally, I'll say this from my own perspective, convinced that the important knowledge and insight and innovation and practices that we need to confront the crisis that we're in is going to come from outside the sort of traditional knowledge sectors, or at least important parts of that wisdom, and these kind of forums are well part of that. So this all makes a lot of sense from our perspective. If I could just do a 30-second, even less, advertorial for the fact that we're hosting in Melbourne in July, 12th to 14th of July this year, the World Eco City Summit, Eco City World Summit. If you Google that, 2017, you'll find the great web page for that. Al Gore will be coming to be the principal speaker at that, but lots of other really interesting things. One of the speakers that I'm really personally, as an urbanist, most excited about, who's signed up, is David Holmgren, who's going to be leading us through some of his work, his more recent work on the necessity of innovation and regenerating the suburban landscape. Melbourne's the setting, the world's most livable city apparently, all fine apart from the fact that it's beset by vertical sprawl, social conflict, social immiseration, homelessness, oligarchic development capital, service monopolies, dangerous climate change, poorly managed growth, rapid destruction, indeed erasure of our heritage. So apart from that, we are the world's most livable city apparently, but I think it is a good place to have a critical conversation about our urban futures in a way that we just aren't having. So anyway, enough from me. I'm really honoured and delighted to be here, and I presume at this point I'll hand over to Anthony for his introductions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Brendan. Please give Brendan a warm hand. Glad you made it. Welcome to everyone. Thanks very much for being here. It's great to see you. My name's Anthony James, the Director of the Rescope Project and host for today. It's another big occasion for us with such special guests, including the one that is on that TV screen static right now, but soon will be dynamic and alive in San Francisco. And also, it's the first time we've tried to do this, to connect with an international guest online. Should be for obvious reasons for people in this room that we would do that. So we hope it works well. So far, so good. The connection is good. It's also significant because it's the last forum in our Regenerating Society series, which is our launch series of the launch of the Rescope project. So we started last week in the State Library with a full house with former financier Satyajit Das. And then we were here yesterday with Tim Costello, Mike Salros and Melissa Wienberg talking about redefining progress. And today we talk about the place of energy in that context and the transition in energy in that context. So it's great to have you here for all that, and terrific to be able to thank our supporters as well, like the MSSI and the EcoCity World Summit, and everyone else who's helped get us to this point. And there are a number of you here today, so thanks very much. Now, the quick housekeeping stuff. Mobile's on silent if you haven't already. You can jump on social media if that's your thing. We're on Facebook and Twitter. And we'll actually continue our experiment with the Q&A dialogue bit at the end. Well, halfway through, we're going to have significant dialogue together. We'll draw questions and comments from the floor, but we'll also do it via Twitter. So feel free to go at that if you like, with the handle Rescope Project and the hashtag, if you like, Renewable Society and/or SLF, hashtag SLFOz. And we'll keep an eye on Twitter while we also tend with roving mics around the room at that time. Now, some of you will have followed our path as the Understandoscope to this point. I mentioned this yesterday, but for those of you who don't know, that was our beginning, founded by a pioneering systems thinker and Australia's inaugural Environmental Educator of the Year, the late Professor Frank Fisher. So he feels still very close to us today. His legacy certainly lives, and we hope to build on it, and now in an evolving form as ever. And now we greet you as a newly incorporated independent not-for-profit organisation geared towards stuff like this and more. Public engagement and education that really tries to get to the heart of what it means to be a sustainable, fair and flourishing society. And what I mean by that is looking at the overarching systems and stories that we live by, because this is no longer a time, if it ever was, for tweaking around the edges or band-aid fixes. Even with the work we do in individual circumstances, we're trying to demonstrate and explore the patchwork that enables it to fit in an overarching structure of society that works, rather than just chipping away at the edges or improving the edges. We do that because there are a series of crises converging, as you guys are probably well aware of, and they include economic, even in its own terms. The GFC bailouts certainly, although they were a number of years ago now, we're seeing the consequences play out in the sense that they lifted any remaining sense of legitimacy to the current system off with more and more people, and not just people who were previously interested in the stuff that the people at this festival probably are. Since then, of course, there's been little structural change, so we are heading, as was covered in our first forum of this series, for another one, another GFC, and probably bigger. And certainly Richard Heimberg has written about this too. And the energy crisis, in inverted commas, but real enough in various respects, sits in that context, a symptom of the broader overshoot. So this is part of what we'll deal with today, but also what the Rescope project is set up for. We are over-industrialising and losing focus on what's most important, what it's all for. And there is opportunity here. So we aim to play a role in that space and how we move beyond the unsustainable consumer growth economy to become a renewable society. We'll be doing this with forums like this, as I said, but we're also exploring the prospect of doing podcasts, webinars. We have an educational background as the Understandoscope, so doing courses, all that sort of stuff, as well as being directly available to individuals or organisations to help not only further a national dialogue in this space, but then help people navigate the change. So today, we share a powerful and much needed dialogue on the place of energy transition in all this. For energy is an area that we're really only just coming to terms with, I think, as a society, only just developing what you might call our energy literacy. And we need to, because we're still caught in relatively simplistic and problematic understandings and representations that, if they remain so, risk slapping us in the face with realities that emerge. So it is vital to keep digging, pardon the pun, in this area for more holistic perspectives within which our various actions can work more effectively. So we'll aim to do that more today. Now, the primer for today's event was the transition to renewable energy is essential, though not enough in itself, to create a sustainable or renewable society. Now, why and what do we need to do individually and collectively to create such a society? To set the scene, I thought it might be useful, and hopefully not stealing any of Richard's thunder, because I'm going to cite him here. This was what he wrote in response to a review on his book, Our Renewable Future, that came out last year. The warning signs that industrial civilization is rapidly approaching non-negotiable planetary limits now flash red. Each of the last 16 months has established an all-time global temperature record. the oil industry appears to have entered a terminal crisis due to its requirement for ever higher levels of investment in order to find, produce, refine and deliver ever lower quality resources. Plant and animal species are disappearing at 1,000 times the normal extinction rate, and global debt levels have soared since the 2008 GFC, setting the stage for an even greater financial convulsion whenever the next cyclical recession hits. So how best to proceed from here? Josh Floyd is a researcher, speaker and consultant in energy systems and societal futures. He started out as a mechanical engineer in the extractive metallurgy industry before moving into futures studies and sustainability education. He worked with Frank Fisher, developing and teaching the unit's principles of sustainability and energy for the future at Swinburne Uni's National Centre for Sustainability. He's now the Rescope Project's Energy, Systems and Society Fellow, as well as sitting on its board. He's also a founding partner with the Centre for Australian Foresight and a member of the editorial board for the journal Futures. His writing has appeared in publications locally and overseas, including The Age, The Conversation, The Epoch Times, Energy Post, and a range of other journals and magazines. It's through our mutual friend and the Rescope Project founder, Frank Fisher, that we met almost a decade ago. So it's a particular pleasure to be sharing the stage and bringing Josh's insights to the conversation. Please give Josh a warm welcome.
Thanks, Anthony, for that very lovely welcome. A quick backgrounder on how I got into this. So I was working as a mechanical engineer in the extractive metallurgy industry through the 1990s and the early 2000s. I spent a lot of time working in China and in India, really at the bleeding edge of their economic development at that time. So I was designing and then installing and starting up smelters to make copper, tin, lead, and do various other things in that sort of area, and really seeing the impact that that was having both positively in an economic sense and the environmental implications of that, and the way that the economic benefits were very clearly not being equally shared. Looking at the trajectory that that might follow, were those countries to follow the same path of development that we followed? It was fairly clear from the position that I was in that it was not going to end well. And that set me on this path that's brought me to the place where I am today. It was fairly clear that we would need to be asking bigger questions than I was able to ask as an engineer working in that area. That said, that background, working in that way with energy systems, really at the front edge of things, stood me in a very, very good stead for being able to have these conversations about energy literacy and what really is involved in making the sorts of transitions that we need to make. So to answer Anthony's framing question, how do we transition to a renewable society? I think most fundamentally, we need to engage all sectors of society in that task, and in fact, every citizen in that task, in that very major challenge, and indeed in what I would frame as a big adventure. So individual citizens, civil society groups and NGOs, businesses, government, everyone needs to be engaged in this. So at the political level, this requires policy instruments that support and influence such a level of engagement and that support people in working together towards a common goal. The tradable energy quota, or TEC system, devised by the late David Fleming, is the best such policy instrument that I'm aware of. It involves putting a hard cap on a nation's emissions from energy use and then freely issuing a share of the quota to every adult. I won't go into all the details here. There's obviously a great deal more to it, but it's something that we could perhaps take up in the conversation as we proceed. But what I like about TECs is that it's designed to close the gap that we currently have between the physical reality of our energy use impact on climate and the political reality of social lock-in to the existing economic system. So this is the policy approach that I think can realistically support a transition to a renewably powered society. But the central issue is engaging every member of society in that task. Present approaches typically either imply that it's all a simple matter of technology change, of swapping out some plant and equipment, building a bit of new infrastructure driven by a tweak or two within the existing political economic order. Or they say, forget it. It can't be done. It's impossible to have renewably powered societies that will allow humans to live well. Both of these approaches are profoundly disempowering for most citizens, but I think the easy transition message is actually by far the more problematic one. To see why this is, it's important to appreciate just how strong the relationship is between a society's energy sources and the ways that members of a society see themselves and the ways that they think. Fossil fuels and petroleum transport fuels in particular have had a profound impact on what it means to be human, and have even had an impact on basic categories of perception, such as the way that we understand time and space. Much of the energy transition discourse is conducted at an extremely abstract level, where energy sources with radically different physical characteristics are reduced to a single numerical parameter or quantity, the number of units of energy in joules that are available over some period of time. The type of modelling associated with this is called an energy balance, and in engineering practice, this is the starting point for understanding any situation in energy terms or for designing systems. It's extremely important and it can give a very useful high-level picture, but it's only the initial starting point, the tip of the iceberg, when it comes to the question of energy transition feasibility. The vastly different physical characteristics of different energy sources have big implications for the practical business of replacing one energy source with another. In working out what is and isn't feasible, it's the details related to these physical attributes that really matter, and that involves a whole spectrum of additional feasibility questions that need to be answered. So when we move from a high-level energy balance view down into the more subtle details, it pretty quickly becomes much less clear that the sorts of social and economic arrangements and even the basic perceptions of things like space and time that have evolved with the use of fossil fuel energy sources can be supported directly with the major renewable sources of solar and wind. So this means that in thinking about and planning for such transitions to fully renewably powered societies, we need to be thinking well beyond supply systems and technologies and systems. We need to also be looking very closely at energy demand expectations and at what we view as normal in terms of the ways of life that we enjoy. In a renewably powered world, on-demand energy will be far more valuable than it is today, and so we'll use it more judiciously. But this also means that we'll find ways of getting what we want from life that are far less reliant on having on-demand, high-quality, concentrated energy sources of the sort that we have now at our fingertips. These changes are fundamentally social and cultural rather than just technological or even political. And it's for this reason that I say so strongly that engaging every member of society in the transition task needs to be our focus. It's critically important for that engagement process that we're upfront about the scale and nature of the challenge. It'll affect just about all aspects of every person's life. And in closing, I'd offer the observation that it's under just such circumstances that we humans are often at our best.
Thanks, Josh. Good to go? All right. Richard, you're live. We just heard that bang and crash. Hello. Now, let's give you a moment. Let's give him a warm hand so he can get his rush to the post. Terrific to have you. I'm glad this has worked out. Now, Richard, just to keep you on your toes, remember 30 to 60 seconds of your personal intro, your personal story, and then on from there. Thanks very much for being here.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yay, all right, good. Well, great to be with you. And my personal story. I don't have a technical background in energy. I'm basically a writer, and something like 25, 30 years ago, I turned to writing as a career in order to give myself the permission to spend most of my time reading and thinking and communicating about the issues that seemed most important. And I ended up reading a lot of anthropology and history, trying to understand how societies evolve and how we got to sort of where we are. And eventually I realized that energy was really at the core of the whole story. When societies change how they get their energy, just about everything else changes as a result. Think about when we went from hunting and gathering to agrarian or agricultural societies. We changed our social relations, the way we made decisions and distributed resources. Our religions and spirituality and philosophies changed. The same thing happened when we moved to the industrial era and started using fossil fuels, energy sources that were extraordinarily energy dense and portable and provided amounts of energy that we'd never seen anything like before. Societies evolved dramatically, rapidly as a result of that. And here we are living in industrial societies and flying across the world, communicating instantaneously with these kinds of gadgets and devices. Amazing stuff. But of course, fossil fuels are depleting non-renewable resources, and using them is resulting in climate change. So we know we've got to move away from fossil fuels one way or another. And that's really the sustainability crisis of the 21st century. If we get this right, then the future beckons. If we don't, then it could be the end of the road for human cultural evolution as we've known it over these last few thousand years. So, what to transition to? The most likely candidates would appear to be solar and wind, renewable resources. And of course, that transition is taking place to a certain extent in some countries faster than others. In the last couple of years, we at Post Carbon Institute decided to take a closer look at that energy transition and what the opportunities and roadblocks might be. So I worked with another one of our post-carbon fellows, David Fridley, who's staff scientist in the energy analysis program at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories here in the US. And we ended up writing a book which is called Our Renewable Future, which you can actually read in its entirety online for free at ourrenewablefuture.org. And essentially, well, there's a lot in the book, and I could talk about it for a lot longer than 10 minutes, as you can imagine. But what we found is that there are many opportunities in the transition, and the roadblocks include the fact that it's going to be very difficult for us to produce as much renewable energy as we're currently using from fossil fuels. Think of it this way. You know, we've made an enormous energy transition over the last couple of centuries from using, stuff like firewood and exerting energy into our environment by way of muscle power, to using not only fossil fuels, but also nuclear power, hydropower, and solar and wind, and so on. And so far, it's been a cumulative process. We just keep adding new energy sources to the ones that we're already accustomed to. What we're talking about doing now is replacing energy sources that currently supply something like 85% of global energy, replacing those with alternative sources that are harder to control because we can't control when the sun shines or the wind blows. And our conclusion was that we need to actually increase the rate at which we're transitioning to renewable sources of energy by about 10 times. In other words, we need to move about 10 times faster if we're going to make this transition in any kind of coordinated way. That seems extremely unlikely to happen without major government intervention in the process. The most likely scenario that we were able to identify is one in which society simply has a lot less energy to work with, and we have to use energy more on nature's terms rather than just whenever and however we want to use it. We also found a lot of challenges in the energy transition in terms of how we use energy. It's not just a matter of building a lot of solar panels and wind turbines. It's also a question of how we use energy in transportation, agriculture, and manufacturing, among other areas. Some of these areas will be relatively easy to transition. For example, we can all drive electric cars with the electricity coming from solar and wind. But most of the rest of the transportation sector is going to be a lot more challenging, especially, for example, the aviation sector. We're not going to be flying electric airplanes. Electric airplanes exist, but they carry one or two people. So the whole aviation industry is really up in the air, if you will, forgive the terrible pun, in terms of the energy transition. Similarly with shipping and trucking. There are solutions there, but they're going to require a lot of fundamental changes in how we do things. In the manufacturing sector, there are a lot of high heat processes that we currently use fossil fuels for to provide sources of heat. For example, in making concrete and steel, but also in consumer electronics. Again, there are theoretically ways of using renewable electricity to supply those sources of high heat, but nobody's doing that now because it would probably cost a lot more, and we need to invent all of the supply chains and processes that would be needed to replace the current technologies. Similarly, in agriculture, we have industrial food systems that rely upon fossil fuels at every step of the way. So what we're really talking about is reinventing society in fundamental ways, which is exactly what you'd expect. If you think about how I started talking about how societies evolve based upon their energy sources. I think it's unrealistic to think that we'll simply replace fossil fuels with renewable sources of energy and continue living the way we're living now. We developed our economy, our whole way of life, what's often called consumerism, as a response to having lots of cheap energy with which to extract resources at ever increasing rates so we could grow the economy, produce jobs, returns on investment for investors, and so on. And that was an economy, that was a way of life that worked in the 20th century. Of course, it had a lot of side effects. By extracting resources at ever increasing rates, we've depleted a lot of the world's most concentrated metals and minerals, as well as fossil fuels. We've overfished the oceans. We've deforested much of the planet. So we know that how we're living now is fundamentally unsustainable on many levels. And the energy transition really forces us to rethink all of that. So what is the renewable energy future going to look like? Well, we don't know exactly until we get there, but there are some principles I think we can use to begin to envision it, one of which is the notion of relocalization. The idea of a global industrial society really rests upon the foundation of fossil fuels for global transport. And as that global transport system is reconfigured to run on much less energy and energy from renewables, it's going to look a lot different. And so relocalizing the economy is going to be a major factor in that. Also, just finding ways to use less energy across the board, relocalizing our food systems, getting fossil fuels out of our food systems in the forms of petrochemicals and fertilizers. I could go on. I think I've been speaking for about 10 minutes, and I'm hoping that the connection hasn't dropped. I'm not hearing anything in my. Oh, now I'm starting to hear something. We're still connected, right?
Yes, you are. Yes,
Good.
thank you very
Hey.
much, Richard. Bang on time too. Well done. Well done. Very good recovery. Appreciate that. And what a terrific encapsulation, that reinventing society, that terminology itself. I mean, it's exciting in a respect. It reminds me of last year's panel, I think it was last year, where Miriam Lyon said we're at a point where we're in a sense recrafting a new constitution to live by. And that is an exciting prospect, but of course daunting in its own way as well. So let's move on. And I guess just to flag also, I did want to flag that it might be something for us to go on to in the Q&A in terms of more of the how we reinvent that society. The use less energy is a key theme. And then I wonder how that might translate to the macro, the big picture as well. But let's move on for the moment. And hopefully, Andrea, you won't have to grapple with a heavy haulage helicopter above us when we're talking about these very issues. But let me introduce you to the audience now. Dr. Andrea Bunting is a sustainable energy educator, consultant and researcher currently exploring the psychology of climate change in action. So I'm particularly pleased to bring this perspective to the table today. She was born in the brown coalfields of Victoria into a state electricity commission family, and from an early age developed an interest in energy systems. She has literally eaten energy systems for breakfast for a very long time. After studying mechanical engineering, she worked in the oil and gas industry and subsequently moved into engineering education. Her concern about the wastefulness and environmental damage of energy systems led her to study the institutional barriers to sustainable energy. She undertook a doctorate in the sociology of technology at the University of Wollongong, focusing on wind energy in Australia. Subsequently, she and a colleague developed the Masters of Sustainable Energy at RMIT, up the road. She left engineering education in 2011 to study the psychological barriers to climate action, and today she spends her time as a grassroots climate activist and is involved with several climate groups. She's particularly interested in the everyday denial about the severity of climate change, so her presence here today brings a vital perspective. Please welcome Andrea Bunting.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. Yes, as he said, I was a brown coal baby, so I grew up in a household where it wasn't uncommon for people to pass around lumps of coal. But that was the 1960s, and Scott Morrison needs to move on. As a mechanical engineer, I also, as Anthony's mentioned, I developed this sort of almost a pathological hatred of energy waste because I could see it everywhere. That was the time, that was the 1970s, where people were talking about energy conservation and there were signs to switch your light off. But I could see it in the systems that that engineers were designing, and I still see this. And so I guess that's one of the main things that drive me. I don't talk about energy conservation and efficiency. I just talk about slashing energy waste. It's far more efficient, less words, less letters. No. And I've studied many and taught and researched in many areas trying to get a handle on what we can do about climate change, but we still haven't got the answers. However, we'll move on. Look, this book, Richard, Our Renewable Future, I didn't realise I could download it for free, but I've read it twice. It's terrific. And if you haven't read it yet, please do. It is a great resource in looking really seriously at the issues of what can we do with renewable energy and what some of the constraints are. And one of my favourite parts of this book, where he talks about planning for this transition to 100% renewable energy, he divides it up into the easy stuff, the hard stuff, and the really hard stuff. Now, the easy stuff, which in Australia apparently is too hard, is replacing coal-fired power with solar and wind, distributed storage, electrifying heating, electric cars, energy efficiency, slashing waste, increasing soil carbon. Now, these are the actions we talk about all the time, and we can't do it, but it's the easy stuff. But then he talks about the stuff that is much harder. Matching the timing of energy usage with when it's available, redesigning our cities, our transport systems, redesigning industrial processes. And he talks about shipping, aviation, agriculture, carbon drawdown, a whole lot of other things, much, much harder. Now, in a truly sustainable world, people will be seriously constrained in what they can do, particularly around travel and also consumption. And they'll be dealing with some very serious climate impacts, as we well know, because these are unavoidable now. So a 100% renewable society really requires that we develop resilient communities. And we do need a massive redistribution of wealth and power, because I think we're unlikely to get much climate action while the rich and powerful believe that they can buy personal protection against climate impacts. Currently, I understand they're buying properties in New Zealand to protect themselves. Anyway, but that is another category. That is the super duper hard stuff. So, my concern is this. When the things we're currently pushing in this domain of the easy stuff, are they actually going to build the type of society that can actually do that harder stuff? And also, what kind of society, what type of governance would we need to ensure that these highly attractive fossil fuels remain locked up forever? And fossil fuels, you know, I don't mean to look at, but they do have some very attractive features. They're compact, they're portable, and they're available when we need them. To make that move to energy sources that give us far less control. How are we going to lock this stuff up? We keep talking about renewable energy in terms of declining costs, but of course past energy transitions have also been about providing greater control. So that's a really important, governance consideration. Now, and in this truly sustainable society, people will need to act collectively rather than individually. So Annie Leonard, who was on this stage, I think, a few years ago, who wrote The Story of Stuff, she talks about our citizen self and our consumer self, and she says that we overwhelmingly regard ourselves as consumers, and urges us to develop that citizen muscle. Now, we all have ideas, I think, about the social aspects of this transition to renewable energy, and perhaps these are implicit, and I think our ideas differ quite a bit, and I'd like to make some of these ideas a bit more explicit, and others may have other ideas too. So, look, many of the ideas from the 1970s are still with us. We were talking about renewable energy back then, of course, and there was a lot of this, and energy slashing waste. Well, these were being proposed in opposition to both nuclear power and also these centralised bureaucratic energy utilities like the SEC. And so that renewable energy was portrayed as being decentralised, and it was to support decentralisation of political power and more cooperative practices. So this meant local control, local jobs, this matching of energy usage with when it's available and so on. And many of these ideas, of course, live on, and I think they're very important. We currently have, for example, a great local example of linking renewable energy with cooperative work practices, and that's Earthworker, which are here today. They have further up there. Another idea that we still are seeing is direct action protests against these powerful interests in the energy sector. But later on, of course, another view developed around a renewable energy society, and this was around this idea of ecological modernisation. That's too many syllables, yes. This regards environmental protection as compatible with economic growth. And the role of governments is then to stimulate the innovation of clean technologies and to regulate the polluting industries. This model is quite compatible with this idea of individual green consumption. And I think, you know, Australian government's not even doing its part in this. And the frustration of many people is that they're seeing many of us as individuals trying to stimulate the use of clean technology through our own individual green consumption. And now, you know, this is great that people are actually trying to challenge this by using their own, installing renewable energy and so on. And this works really well with solar PV because it's so modular. But it's a double-edged sword. It's about pushing this idea of individual green consumption. And I think there's a very dominant idea that all we need to do is stop these polluting industries and just let the green industries flourish. And also I think this is highly problematic too. These green industries are in the business of selling more stuff, of growth, and also fostering this idea of individual green consumption. So this raises the question, and I think this is not this is not leading us to the type of society that can do these much harder stuff that Richard's book has spoken about. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrea. There's a stack of good stuff we can go on from there. Thank you very much to the three of you for kicking us off. I wonder if I can put a question to you. Maybe I'll start with you, Josh, but feel free to come in, Richard and Andrea. Now, a lot of the work that you guys are well familiar with, I'll just cite one name, Vaclav Smil, where he demonstrates that our quality of life returns on our energy use diminish from a fairly modest level of energy use. That is to say, once we pass a certain threshold of energy use, we don't gain much in terms of quality of life, and we have well passed those thresholds. So my question around that is, we still appear to be, as a society in our governance structures, quite daunted by the prospect of, let's call it degrowth, or even call it recession, or energy descent. I mean, these are the terms we could use. Now, those terms like recession and confronting that changing sort of macro dynamic have been frightening to us in the past. But clearly research like what I just cited points to the possibility that sort of dynamic may actually have positive outcomes. Yet we are very fixed on the idea that we mustn't go there at all costs. We must stimulate that consumer growth at all costs and just find ways to green it. Now, why is that, and how can we navigate that? Josh, do you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, well, this idea, so Vaclav Smil has studied that quite closely, looked at a number of indicators of societal well-being, and found that when you look at those across all nations, the nations with the very highest levels of energy use, particularly some of the Middle Eastern countries, their scores on things like the Human Development Index start to really taper off and even decline below the level of some other countries along with their very high energy use. So there's some fairly clear indications there that more and more energy use is not beneficial, and it's fairly obvious if you think about it. This really goes back even to the work of Ivan Illich in the early 70s, 1960s and early 70s, who pointed out that high energy societies are fundamentally undemocratic. The more energy we use, the more people have to buy into the economic order that is part of that and participate in that in order to be able to live well within the society that they're in. So they lose choice. So people lose choice. You no longer have the choice to opt out of that if you want to be able to participate in employment and in other areas of social life. So I think this is a really important idea to consider, that really the idea that energy use is fundamentally good and having more and more of it is a good thing is something we really need to question.
Yeah, that's terrific, relating to the governance structures again that Andrew was talking about. We might go on with that. Can I bring Richard in first? Richard, is this an opportunity for us, in a sense, you know, selling the ideas we're presenting today, that there's positive potential in it in terms of democracy, let alone the other aspects of what we might call our quality of life?
Yeah, well, that phrase quality of life, I think, is really key because if we are nearing the end of economic growth as we knew it during the 20th century, and I think all of the indicators are that that's the case. I mean, even if you just look at the rate of GDP growth globally over the past couple of decades, and especially in the so-called developed world, U.S., Australia, European nations, and so on, the rate of growth has been slowing, and professional economists are looking at that and scratching their heads and saying, "Well, what's going on?" Well, the problem is the law of diminishing returns. You know, we're applying more and more energy and resources at the process of growth, and we're getting less and less real returns from that. And the only way we're keeping this growth machine even appearing to be on track is with massive amounts of debt and very low interest rates in the United States, so on. We could talk about that. All of the returns, as you mentioned at the beginning of this session, going to the top 1% or 10%. So the only way we can get off this treadmill is to realize that pursuing endless GDP growth is impossible. It's pointless. It's physically, mathematically impossible for anything to grow forever on a finite planet. So the question is, what is the optimum scale and size of human society on the planet, of our rates of per capita consumption, and aim for a society that is ecologically sustainable, that we can operate for not just a century, but many centuries, thousands of years into the future. And what's a level of consumption that supports human well-being? And actually, a lot of thought has already gone into that. And as Josh was mentioning, you know, there's a level of consumption that's much lower than the rate in already developed nations, where the quality of life maxes out in terms of input values. And that's what we should be aiming for. So where we have, for example, the nation of Bhutan working with gross national happiness instead of gross national product or gross domestic product, there's a real beacon for the future if we start paying attention to what it is that makes people happy in their lives, a sense of connection with the people around them and with nature, a sense of doing meaningful work, contributing to their communities, having cultural events to participate in. Those are things that don't necessarily imply ever higher levels of energy consumption. So if we focus on those things, making life better for people, then we can actually get off the accelerator pedal of GDP and energy consumption and have a transition that really works for everyone.
Thanks very much. Yes, you mentioned the optimal scale and size, and it's interesting to me that that's a pretty standard business concept within those micro settings, yet it seems such a leap for us to use that at the macro level. But what would our optimum GDP per capita be? And then if you grappled with that, then you could indeed map a scale down to that point on basis of benefit, not sacrifice. So that is interesting. And just for your information, Richard, yesterday on this panel we had Mike Salvaris. Maybe you've met him along the journey somewhere. He's developing with a team here at the University of Melbourne, since I believe almost last week, I think he said, the Australian National Development Index. So it's Australia's equivalent, in effect, to the gross national happiness in Bhutan. So that's a
Right.
project that's getting off the ground now. So stay tuned to that. ANDI, I think it's andy.org.au, maybe just .org. You can find
Yeah.
it online, and hopefully you'll hear more of it.
Could I say just one other thing?
Yeah, please.
When David Fridley and I were looking at likely quantities of energy available on a per capita basis in an all renewable society, of course, it requires a lot of speculation. We're not there yet. There's so much territory between here and there to traverse, but we came to the conclusion it's sensible to assume about 10 to 25% the current energy per capita consumption of people in the United States. It would be a little, the percentage would be a little bit different in Australia and Europe. But that's the kind of rate of consumption we're talking about, something really substantially lower than what's considered normal today.
Yeah, interesting. Now, I'm going to go to you, Andrea, but just a reminder, we'll go to Q&A after Andrea speaks here, so use Twitter if you want to. I believe it's being monitored, am I right? Yes? And there are roving mics too, so you can stick your hand up if you've got a question or a comment to inject into the debate, but please be concise. I mean, say what you've got to say, be concise, and we'll get through as many as we can. But first to you, Andrea, did you want to add a comment to that?
Is this working? Yes. Yeah, just a brief point in terms of, yes, as I said before, this whole idea of consumption. There's a whole industry whose job it is to push us to consume, of course, and that's very powerful. And, as Annie Leonard had said, this is how we see ourselves as consumers, and we're quite happy to become green consumers, but it's still that same model. And it's incredibly hard to challenge when you've got this whole industry whose job it is to make us consume more so that they can make more stuff. We also become very used to certain ways of living. You know, I grew up in the 60s and my life was very comfortable, and what do I have now that I didn't have then? We've become used to certain things, like, I think the flying is the big thing, and other form, transport. We travel far more. We become acclimatised to having a very comfortable range of temperatures in our homes. No one had air conditioning when I was a child. And things like that. So there's a whole lot of things that are locking us into this pattern.
Yeah, that's terrific. In fact, we were talking a bit earlier because Satyajit Das, the financier that we had on last week at the State Library, in his book, A Banquet of Consequences, he talks about that point, that really we're not talking something so far out of the realm of possibility or even preference. It was only a couple of generations ago, and arguably the majority of the world's population today, that's living in circumstances that we might find are about the fit. So it's interesting when if you can, recast it in that light. But I guess it requires looking a bit beyond what's right in front of you. Now, have we got a question from you guys? Roving mics? I'll follow the mics. Yep, terrific. Thank you. Pick an easy one. Good job. Thanks. And stand up if you could, and give us your name too.
Oh yeah, thanks. My name's Phil. A question for Richard. There was a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences 2015 by John Shramsky, where he describes human civilization as running on an Earth space battery. Are you familiar with that, Richard?
I think I saw that at the time, but refresh my memory and.
Well, he suggested that the Earth is a battery that's trickle charged over millennia, and that human civilization is now depleting that battery. The energy has been stored through photosynthesis as fossil fuels, and that as we reach thermodynamic equilibrium with space, there will be less energy available. I mean, I see that a large part of this challenge is communication. How useful is that as a tool for communicating the challenge, the energy challenge?
Yeah, I think that's a valuable study and image The reality is we've gotten used to using enormous amounts of energy in the form of stored sunlight. And what we're talking about doing is moving to using solar energy in real time, both in the form of sunlight and also wind, which is created by the warmth of sunlight. And so, realistically, fossil fuels were a one-time only gift to humanity. And we did amazing things with them, but we can't imagine living the same way. We shouldn't try to imagine living the same way as we get off of fossil fuels, as we got used to during the fabulous fiesta of the 20th century. So yeah, any imagery that folks can latch onto in that regard is really helpful. That little video that Post Carbon Institute did a couple of years ago called 300 Years of Fossil Fuels in 300 Seconds, I think is helpful in that as well.
Yeah. Cheers, Richard. Josh, please.
Yeah, Phil, thank you very much for mentioning that. I saw that article and found it very, very worthwhile. Anyone who has even the slightest sort of technical inclination, I'd encourage to chase that down and have a read of it. I think from an educational perspective, in terms of illustrating the nature of the challenge, it's one of the best pieces of academic work that I've seen in a long time. But just to put a couple of numbers on that I think help to illustrate it, most people here will be familiar with the idea that there's enough energy or solar energy arriving on the Earth's surface in a bit less than an hour to provide all of the energy that we use from all other sources in a year. That they're equivalent in terms of the number of joules of energy arriving in that time. Of course, there are vastly different things going on there in terms of the physical form that those energy forms are in. So energy in an hour from the sun, about equivalent to what we use in a year. The flip side of that, though, is that it took about 500 million years for those other energy sources that we're using to accumulate. So about 500 million years of fossil fuel accumulation, that is fossilised sunlight, and we're going through it in less than 500 years. But let's call it 500 years. That's 500 million years of accumulation, 500 years of use. There's a million-fold factor difference in the rate at which we're using those energy sources compared to the rate at which they accumulated. And that's the battery metaphor that they're referring to in that article, plus the fact that we're also burning through not just the stored sunlight and fossil fuels, but also the biosphere as well.
Thanks, Josh. Another question? You're right? Carly, thank you.
Hello, Scott, and I used to work with all the car clubs all around the world, and
just put the mic up a bit.
Yeah, Scott, and used to work with car clubs all around the world. So, for example, RACV, AAA in America, and looking at lobbying those type of membership base to make statements into helping us change. So, for example, AAA in the US has 53 million members. There's like 8 million car club members here, and they don't want to touch that area because it goes against the car traditional one. But if in events like this we're collecting membership numbers and using it the same as how you lobby political, but you're using powerful membership-based organisation to affect change. And if you affect the car, they buy a electric vehicle, the first thing is that someone who's got solar, good target for electric vehicle. Someone who's got an electric vehicle and solar, good target for a battery. Someone who's got all those three, good target to follow them into their work. And if they own an organisation, start affecting change in their organisation. So.
Thanks for the comment. Did anyone want to comment, or we move to the next one? Yeah, thank you. Next.
Thank you. Jean Blackley, and I sort of want to link a couple of things we've just touched on there, which is when we think about energy use and the notion of there's a year's worth of energy hitting the surface of the Earth in terms of solar energy every hour. Meanwhile, Richard has talked about a notion of it would be really good if we were using about 10 to 25% of the energy levels that the current American and pretty much Australian consumer uses each year. If we think about in terms of capitalism, and that capitalism could be considered the most successful economic model in the world from certain measures in the last few hundred years, and we think about individual human nature, which is more short-term oriented, more about me and my needs rather than the collective and giving up for others. I'm interested to hear from Richard and Andrea and Josh from how is a realistic path forward to say, we need to cut our energy use, have a much different standard of living and a different approach? Or what if we say that's not going to work with human nature, that we're too selfish? There's billions of people on the planet who are on the brink of having a quality of life that Australians have enjoyed for 3 decades. I'm interested to hear from the three of you, how can we tweak capitalism and individual motivation and the desire for consumption and the quality of life? Yes, we know it would be nice if we tempered it, but how can we harness the best of capitalism
Thank
in
you.
this context of energy use?
Thanks. I'm very glad you raised human nature. That might draw a comment or two. Anyone like to go first?
Oh, I'll just make a comment about, I think it's harnessing it at the moment very successfully to lock us into an idea of individualised green consumption, and which I think is highly problematic. But I think when we talk about human nature, we have this idea that people are selfish and, look out for ourselves and all that. And what happens when there's a crisis? I don't know, I was in the Wollongong floods and other people have been in various crises. What happens? People act collectively. So when it really matters, people come together and they work together to help others. So this idea about, that we are individualised, who will look after our own interests and so on, is not really what happens when there's the as I said, is in the crisis. So how do we? Yes. I don't think we can harness capitalism. I mean, I think this is the problem. It is pushing a very individualised model, and I think we need to be stressing these other collective models that really do, is the best of us, and is what emerges when we are facing crisis, which, let's face it, we are. So that
underpinning stories that we tell ourselves about who we are fundamental here. Richard or Josh?
Yeah, I'd be happy to make a comment. Consumerism makes us more individualistic. That's the goal of the consumer society, is to atomize us so that each of us is, sitting in front of our own personal computer screen or TV screen and ordering stuff from Amazon.com or whatever, and we never cooperate really. But cooperation is going to be the essential basis for moving toward a sustainable society, and that means changing some of the economic institutions that currently support individualism and economic growth, like the publicly traded corporation. The corporation is designed to grow or die. So of course we have to have an economy based on never-ending growth in order for corporations to survive. And that leads us right up to the brick wall of the end of growth. Corporations are not fit to survive in the world that's ahead of us. So what's a different institution that could work? Well, the cooperative. If people are working together to produce and distribute goods and own the basis of production, then they're free to have any values at the guiding them that they choose together, whether it's providing decent workplace and incomes to to workers, or providing good quality products to customers. Those can be the number one goals, rather than continually increasing market share or growth. So that's just one example, but it goes to the heart of what we're talking about when we're talking about a fundamental shift in the design of the economy in order to make the energy transition.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated how that relates to, from the governance model's perspective, not just in the macro society, but in the organisations that we work in. It does indeed go at that reinventing ourselves. Josh, did you have a comment to add to that?
Well, yeah, I think just very briefly that as long as maximised material consumption is the basis for individual and collective social well-being, then that is exactly the situation we'll have. We will not be able to deal with this, and what will happen is that the ecological consequences and the resource consequences for the economy will come into play at some point, and that's how things will change. I hope that's not the case, but the only way we will address that is if we're prepared to, particularly those of us in the rich world, prepared to experiment with and develop alternative ways of organising things. But that idea of maximised material consumption as a basis of well-being is a very narrow idea. It's culturally narrow, it's historically narrow. There are many cultures throughout human history, throughout the human story, that have been based on very, very different sets of values and ideas. And I mean, here we are in Australia with Aboriginal culture, with a history that yesterday Bruce Pascoe told us now stretches back 80,000 years, according to some of the latest research down at Warrnambool. 80,000 years of culture that is based on completely different foundations. Now, that surely demonstrates to us that other ways of organising for lives well lived are within our grasp. They're certainly within human grasp. So they might be very different to what we've now got globally, but certainly if you look back through a much broader sweep of history, this is a very, very strange, small anomaly that we're living through at the moment.
Thanks, Josh. Next question.
My name's Roger. What we seem to be, or the elephant in the room seems to be the fact that we don't talk about politics. And the only way we're going to be able to implement any of what we've been talking about today is by getting politicians on board. Unfortunately, there seems to be denial across quite a widespread part of the society, both in Australia, in the United States currently, and in other countries around the world. How do we convince the politicians to stop denying what's going on? Or do you think there's an element of being scared to tell the public what really is happening and where we are for creating fear?
Very good question. Thanks very much. It's your remit, isn't it?
Thanks for the easy softball question.
That's right.
I think people are, there's a growing sense of people wanting to challenge these power structures. As I said, I think we shouldn't think that everything happens in Parliament. Some people, as I said, are trying to challenge the government's denial over renewables by doing it themselves. And of course, those efforts should be applauded, even though I said it fits in that model of individual consumption. But there are other people who, they're chaining themselves to this and whatever. We've got a growing sense, especially among young people, of trying to challenge those political structures. So this, I know we've got, we live in such a polarised society. It's becoming, as we know, very polarised, and we know all these problems with, what's happening in the United States and seemingly here. My thing is, of course, it's not just at the ballot box. We've got to think about politics far more broadly, and I think a lot of young people are doing that, and that's great. And I'm sort of an old person now and given up full-time work, and I want to spend my time with activism. So it's politics at that sort of grassroots level that I think we should be focusing on, rather than those people in Parliament House.
Richard or Josh, anything to add?
Sure, I totally agree with what Andrea just said, and especially when at the end of her comment when she talked about grassroots efforts and work. You know, the elites who are running our nation states are currently in a state of complete denial with regard to the ecological crisis that's confronting civilization. And I don't hold out much hope that they're going to see the light and suddenly, you know, either inform us of what's really going on or start acting rationally with regard to that. So I think it's really up to us in the communities where we live to begin to build the basis for a different way of living and thinking that will percolate up to higher levels of social and political organization. I think the transition town movement is a good effort in that direction. I don't think it's sufficient, but it's at least a start at developing resilient and cooperative communities where, you know, we can take the energy transition to the streets and implement it without waiting for national governments to recognize the need for it.
Yeah, well, I opened by saying that really, if we're going to deal with this energy transition adequately, we've got to engage every single person in it. And I just make the observation that I think politicians don't lead, they follow what we want them to do. And so this really needs to proceed, and I think this is in agreement with what Richard and Andrea have just been saying, from the politics of the kitchen table, and every person who's here having these conversations and making them part of the things that they're talking about with people wherever they happen to be. We've got to seed these ideas so that they are not radical or exceptional or unusual, that they are commonplace. And I think when we have those conversations more and more, they will become more commonplace and more obvious. So I think it's about us providing the leadership from this level. It's got to come from the citizenry.
And I guess we can have in mind that that denial, it's going to hit the walls and things will fragment a bit around that, as they already are. So to be ready, to have prepared the ground, so to speak, for what comes next will still be increasingly relevant. I think we've got time for one more, probably.
Hi, I'm Jane, and we actually have a campaign that is pretty much, I think, what's needed here, because what we're talking about is that we have to make the shift from everyday mode where we're sort of selfish and we're sort of consumer-oriented to emergency mode, where we're working together, we've got a single focus, we're doing what's required, we're not being selfish anymore. And there's a whole lot of climate groups in Australia, 44 now, who think that declaring a climate emergency is how you draw that line in the sand, where you move from, well, we've got a lot of things on, to focus. So Andrea or anyone else would like to comment about the idea of declaring a climate emergency, campaigning for that. We've got our council already to declare a climate emergency, because we worked at the grassroots to elect a council that would.
Which council was that?
That's Darebin, but there's some others coming along right behind.
Yes, I think Moreland just did too. We did some work there, in Climate Action Moreland on that. Look, I think this idea that, yes, look, drawing a line in the sand, but it also brings this idea that we need a massive plan. Now, Richard has talked about this. You know, planning is not a trendy word, is it? Because we talk about markets. And to shift that dialogue to thinking that the market is going to deliver this, to this idea that, and I suppose we are getting back to governments there, but we do need some strong planning, and I think this needs to be at all levels, to really drive this transition. So I like this, idea of the line in the sand, but really that it's not something that's going to gradually emerge with the market. And we should be challenging that idea. And this whole, climate emergency declaration, strong planning to drive the transition, I think, is a way of changing that dialogue.
Richard or Josh? Only if you have no compulsion to have a comment on that.
Yeah, well, I totally agree that declaring a climate emergency is not only is it warranted, of course, but I think it's a good strategic move. Folks have to understand that the scale and scope of the challenge facing us. I mean, this is literally a survival challenge for humanity within our lifetimes. This is something that no generation of human beings has ever faced before. We're not just talking about a survival challenge for a single human population, a single community. We're talking about the totality of human society on Earth, and we really should be thinking of it also in terms of the community of species on Earth, because this is impacting literally millions of other fellow creatures kinds of fellow creatures on our planet. So yes, this is all hands on deck. I was happy to hear Josh mention tradable energy quotas earlier on when he spoke, because I agree, this is a really potentially very useful policy tool that could be used in planning to shift the direction of the economy toward the transition and change the kinds of incentives that people experience in their daily lives, so that there's an incentive for them to use less energy, to find ways of conserving, of shifting their priorities, and see the benefit in their own lives of doing that. And the more we explore and implement those kinds of reinforcing policies and behaviors, the easier this is going to go.
Missed. Yeah, this is something the one that I'd like to respond to, and I've perhaps got a slightly different take on this. This is a conversation that I've been involved with recently, and I know there's at least one person in the room who's been part of that conversation that I've been involved in with respect to the framing as a climate emergency. And I think it has an important place, but I think there are places where it's less helpful. I think if that framing is going to be used, we need to be prepared to take action that is consistent with that. And I think the actions that are consistent with that framing are perhaps far more radical than most people are perhaps willing to confront, perhaps even many of us here in this room. I think what both Richard and Andrea have said about the need to adopt a very unfashionable planning orientation towards this needs to be considered here. That is the idea of long-term planning consistent with the emergency framing? I think there's some important questions there. We're talking now about trying to work on a path to target. So the idea of, it's now widely accepted from the science that there is a global carbon budget that we need to stay within. And for better or worse, the global conversation has converged around 2 degrees. The benefit of that is it means that people are working towards a clear idea of a target. Now, I don't think that 2 degrees is consistent with the framing as a climate emergency, but I do think that we need to be thinking in terms of a planned trajectory of change. If we were to accept, and I think there's a lot of validity in this, that we have already locked in far too much warming, far more warming than can possibly be considered safe, then we might say that really we've got to basically shut things down tomorrow. Now, the implications of that are human suffering on an unimaginable scale. So we are in a very, very difficult situation here where if we were to respond with what is really needed in terms of the climate, looking after the ecological situation, really the implications for in human terms and social terms are quite unimaginable. I think this is there are no easy answers here, but I personally favour working towards this idea of a path to target and pushing very hard on that and having a firm plan on how we are going to decarbonise, accepting the unpleasant side of that is that in doing so we will be locking in further warming.
Thanks very much, Josh, and that's where we'll have to leave it today. Thanks to all of you for that terrific conversation, and please give a warm hand to all of our guests, Richard Heimberg, Josh Boyd and Andrew Bunting. Thank you very much. And Richard, your gift is in the mail, and I'm not joking, it really is. Thank you very much for being with us today. Now, we're also, as I mentioned, we're celebrating the launch of the Rescope project, and one of the things we'd like to do is, well, we have been doing, and it's been pretty popular, is to offer you the book, The Collected Works of our founder, Frank Fisher. It's at the back there with the team, half price, so $10 just for today. Thanks for being part of our launch. And we also launched a field guide this week. So that's designed to be where you can look at and indeed contribute to stories that map out on the ground the sorts of changes we're talking about. So you'll get to have a look at the one story that's up there now and get a sense of the way that businesses to community groups and some governments are charting this course anew at that systemic level. So yeah, please do have a look and be part of it if you've got something to contribute there. Now, as I mentioned, our vision is to collaborate to further this dialogue at a national level and to help people and organisations navigate that change. So we are in dialogue these days with partners, sponsors, philanthropists and so on, so we'd be keen to hear from anyone who might be interested in speaking with us. Now, finally, you can see us next at the Transitions Film Festival, which starts this week. It's part of the Sustainability Festival. It starts Thursday. You'll see us hosting a movie on Friday and Saturday. Check out the Transitions Film Festival program. It's a terrific package as well. Now, I'd like to thank Lisa for filming us up the back. Thanks, Lisa. Sarah McConnell, our illustrator up the front. You'll see film and illustration on our website shortly. Professor Brendan Gleeson, thanks very much for introducing us, and the MSSI and EcoCity for partnering with us here. The SLF2, Sian, the venue coordinator. She's generally not far away. Thank you very much. Luke, the director, and all the volunteers. Zach on sound and rescuing the Skype. Good work. Our friends at Smart Snacks, responsible for that. And Greenwood Orchards also provided a box of biodynamic apples yesterday, but they all went. The crowd ate them all. So I'm sorry you missed those. I'll try and get double next time. All the wonderful people at the Rescope Project, thanks very much. All our supporters. You can see them up the back in the Rescope Project t-shirts, and you can sign up to our email list and get on social media, and you can donate too if you can or want to. Above all, please thank our guests once again. Thank you for being here. We'll see you again soon.